Welcome to another episode of Dr. D's Philosophy and Critical Thinking class. In this video, we're going to talk about the second chapter from Bertrand Russell's The Problems of Philosophy. And just to set the stage here, remember that in chapter 1, Russell distinguishes between appearance and reality and between sense data and physical objects. And he's asking the question, is it a good inference to draw the conclusion that there is a real physical table on the basis of what our sense data are like? Remember that sense data are things like sounds and smells and tastes and textures. They're the way things appear to us. Now, we might wonder, could it be that what we call the table is really just a collection of sense data? Is that a possibility? Russell thinks that we have good reason to reject this proposal. He gives two different reasons. So one, we might call it object permanence. If you take the table and you put a tablecloth over it, the sense data that you were having of the table are now gone, because the sense data of what seemed to be a rectangular white table they're gone. You can't observe them anymore. They don't figure into your perception. But presumably the table itself doesn't disappear, even though the sense data disappear. So this basic example seems to suggest that the table can't just be a collection of sense data. Second reason Russell thinks that what we call tables and chairs and rocks and whatnot can't just be collections of sense data is that physical objects are public or viewable to different people, whereas sense data are private. If I'm looking at the table from my own perspective, it might be that this angle close to me appears obtuse, but from your perspective on the other side of the room, it's precisely that angle that appears to be acute rather than obtuse. So we have different sense data, but it seems quite odd to say that the table itself is different for different people. The idea would be, no, the table just is what it is, even though we have different sense data. And so since the sense data are different, but the table remains unchanging, one and the same thing, it can't be that the table is just the same thing as a collection of sense data. All right. Russell's main achievement in this chapter is to consider some arguments for thinking that there is such a thing as a real table. And we could generalize from his arguments here and say that these are arguments that would warrant us to draw the conclusion that there is such a thing as matter, where matter is supposed to be distinct from minds and their ideas. All right, so Russell's first argument, this is an argument for thinking that matter is real, that there is a real physical table, runs as follows. Just as one premise in the argument. The premise is that different people have similar sense data. Right? So even though our sense data is different, you have your sense data over there, I have mine over here, there's a similarity between our sense data. Right? It's not like the table appears to be radically different from your perspective. My description of what my sense data are like when I look at the table is quite similar to your description of what your sense data are like when you look at the table. Russell says, well, according to this idea, maybe we can draw the conclusion that there's got to be a public object out there, observable to both of us, and that would be the thing that causes both of our sense data. All right, is this argument any good? Russell says no. And why does he say that? He says it's a question-begging argument. It's a circular argument. Why is it question-begging? It's question-begging because it presupposes that there are other people in addition to oneself. And remember, what we're trying to do in this chapter is get ourselves an argument that justifies us in drawing the conclusion that there are real physical things out there in addition to my own private sense data. Right? So you have your own private sense data, and what we're trying to get out of this chapter is an argument from your sense data to the conclusion that there are real physical things in your environment. Well, if that's the kind of argument that you're looking for, you can't just help yourself to the idea that there are other people out there. Because if you help yourself to that idea, then you're really just assuming that there are other people rather than explaining how it is that you can know there are other people by making an inference from your sense data. So likewise, we could say, well, of course there's a real table out there. Russell would say, well, how do you know that? And you just say, well, there just is. I can just see it. And he's going to say, well, look, there's a distinction between sense data and physical object. How can you know there's a real physical object based on your sense data, right? Is it possible to make a good inference from sense data to physical object? You can say the same thing about what seem to be other real people, right? Is that a good inference that you're drawing from your sense data that you might think suggests there are real people? So inference from the sense data of other people to the conclusion that other people are real. Right? That's the very kind of argument that we're looking for here. So of course, we can't help ourselves to the very claim that there are other real people. That is precisely what is at issue in this chapter. All right, so Russell's first argument, he says, is no good. It's question begging, doesn't work. Second argument that he offers is one that he thinks does work. It does give us an explanation of how it is that we can at least have reasonable belief in things like real physical objects like tables. All right, so the second argument is what's called an inference to the best explanation. Consider two possible hypotheses. One is what we might call the common sense hypothesis. According to this hypothesis, in addition to my own sense data, there are real physical objects. That's just a common sense view of reality. Another possible hypothesis is what we could call the skeptical hypothesis, which says that there are only my sense data and that's it. So maybe only I exist. This is a possibility that's called solipsism in philosophy. Only I exist. So it's really just my sense data and that's it. All right, now which of these hypotheses does a better job in explaining one's own sense data? So just focus on your own sense data and really entertain this possibility that you are the only thing that exists. It's just you and your sense data. Now, which of these hypotheses, the common sense hypothesis or the skeptical hypothesis, best explains your sense data? Well, Russell says your sense data seem to be well ordered over time. Later sense data that you have is related to earlier sense data that you had in a more or less reliable, kind of uniform way. So the example he gives is an example of his cat, where he says, look, in the morning I wake up and I have sense data that seem to represent a hungry cat in front of me. I feed the cat, or at least it seems to me that I do, right? And then I seem to go off to work and I seem to come back to my house later on in the day, and I seem to be presented with a cat, and it seems like the cat is hungry again. It seems like a cat is coming up to me and brushing itself up against my ankle as though it wants to be fed. Well, look, if there's really just sense data and there's no real physical cat, why would it seem to me that there was a cat that was full in the morning when I left, and then a cat that's hungry later on in the day? Sense data don't get hungry over time. Only real physical cats get hungry over time. So on the common sense hypothesis that there is a real physical cat out there waiting for me while I'm at work, its appetite growing over time, that's a hypothesis that can explain why my sense data are the way that they are. What about the skeptical hypothesis? Well, there's no particular reason why my sense data would be ordered in this way rather than in some other way. Right? So maybe, one skeptical scenario or hypothesis might be Descartes' evil demon hypothesis. Right? Why would an evil demon present you with what seems to be a full cat in the morning and a hungry cat at night? The experience is that the evil demon could feed into your mind. It could be anything. Right? There's no particular reason why it'd be like one way rather than another. Right? So the skeptical hypothesis doesn't really explain why your sense data are the way that they are, whereas the common sense hypothesis does. Another way of saying all of this is Russell thinks that the common sense hypothesis is a simpler hypothesis, better fits with our instinctive beliefs that we have about the way the world is. It provides us with a more systematic way of explaining our sense data than any skeptical hypothesis that we might imagine. All right, so, doubt could remain. It's not like Russell has given us a bulletproof argument for believing in the existence of a real physical external world. And he doesn't take himself to have done that. He thinks that he's provided us with a reasonable basis for thinking that there are real physical objects, real other people. That's what he's done in this chapter.